Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tomek, for inviting me to the American Studies Network meeting to say a couple of words about my sociological research of the Polish community, Polish immigrant community of Greenpoint in Brooklyn. This is the title of my presentation, Upward Mobility Without Moving, Polish Immigrant Community Leaders' Attitudes Toward Gentrification of Greenpoint. It's on the basis of the empirical research fieldwork that I conducted in Greenpoint in the first half, in the second half, in the first decade, in the second half of the first decade of the 21st century, between 2006 and 2010. So I'm going to speak about Greenpoint, a neighborhood in Brooklyn, located in the northernmost part of Brooklyn. These are the numbers of the community boards. They don't matter in my presentation. This is just the best map I found in terms of seeing the connection of Greenpoint to Manhattan. On the one hand, this is the southern tip of Manhattan to the lower Manhattan. And on the other hand, across the border to Ridgewood, where Polish migrants displaced by gentrification in Greenpoint move. So when you say that they are displaced and they have to move to Queens, sounds dramatic, but when you realize that it's just one stop of subway, although it's a different borough, it doesn't seem to be so painful. So, starting the study on the Polish immigrants in Greenpoint, I expected at the time of very intensive gentrification that the neighborhood was going on, exactly in the first decade of the 21st century. I expected them to oppose gentrification, and especially to leaders, community leaders. Polish immigrants who had the position of community leaders to oppose gentrification as the neighborhood was losing its Polishness, and by that fact they were losing their subjects, right? So I expected this frustration of leaders of losing their subject and not being leaders anymore. What I found was exactly opposite. I found that they were rather satisfied or indifferent. But if satisfied and benevolently predisposed toward gentrification, it's because they interpret it as something positive for themselves personally, for their children, for their relationship with their American-born children, and also, to my surprise, they interpret it as something positive for the Polish-American ethnic group in New York City. And this is the thesis, the interpretation that I gave to this attitude, upward mobility without moving. This is the summary of their experience. They didn't do anything to improve their situation, to experience upward mobility. They didn't get a new degree. They didn't get a new job. They didn't move to some other place. They stayed where they were, and all of a sudden they became millionaires and people who became considered cool, cool and surrounded by people, hipsters with artistic and intellectual aspirations. So this is what I prepared for today. The project itself was not only about that, but this is what I'm going to speak about today. So the first decade was really crucial for the dramatic changes in the neighborhood and in Brooklyn in general. We should see the gentrification of Greenpoint as a part of a process that was called by a leading sociologist of gentrification, Sharon Zukin, a sociology professor at the City University of New York, in the process of Brooklyn becoming cool. In the process of Brooklyn being associated with social problems, first with the working class in the by the time of the 1950s, then with the social problems, crime, drugs associated with the African Americans and Puerto Ricans in New York City, into the borough with the artistic and intellectual flavor. So Greenpoint was, before the Second World War, was a typical Brooklyn white Catholic working class neighborhood with industrial plants, very industrial, more industrial than other parts of New York City, in New York City, and this was the place, together with the adjacent Williamsburg, that was a home not only to the light industry that was characteristic for New York City, but also heavy industry. Glass sugar Domino factory was located there. So it was Catholic, working class, industrial, with industrial plants located in the waterfront, and residential areas of small two-story working class houses, wooden frame houses were located in the interior of the neighborhood. It was white and Catholic in the way characteristic for the American history of that these were Catholics migrating to the United States at the turn of the 19th and 20th century that made the core of the American working class. And the neighborhood was dominated by the Irish, Italians, and Polish immigrants. In the post-Second World War period, when the rest of the city and rest of Brooklyn was turning to become the center of the African American and Puerto Rican settlement, Greenpoint remained white and working class, right? So it neither went through gentrification in the early post-industrial period in the 1960s, 70s or 80s, nor was turned into the black and Latino neighborhood that was typical for many neighborhoods in Brooklyn of that kind. It was to a certain degree connected with the racist grassroots policies characteristic for the community of working class Americans of the Polish, Irish, and Italian origins who sold and rent the houses only by the word of mouth, even after the introduction of the anti-discrimination civil rights policies. So that in the 1980s, the white character and working class character of the neighborhood was strengthened by the influx, quite massive influx of the Polish immigrants that, unlike Puerto Ricans and African Americans, were very much welcomed by this working class American population. The adjacent, and so this would be the representation of this Greenpoint that was created by the Polish immigrants in the 1980s and 1990s. This is the restaurant Pod Wierchami in a very modest, if not cheap, wooden frame house. The owner was an immigrant of the early 1990s, already the post-communist period, a farmer, a peasant by origins from Podlasie, who moved to New York City and was catering to Polish immigrants coming from work, from construction work, hungry and tired, to pick their food in cafeteria. What is here is Podlasie meat market that still exists that was a store with Polish food, also for the same working class, tired and hungry men coming back from work, because the Polish immigrant community was very much at the time in the 1980s and 1990s dominated by men. So what happened in the 1990s was the gentrification of the adjacent Williamsburg, that became the center of coolness and representation of what was the coolest in the Brooklyn history and contemporary history, became already an object of tourism from Europe and East Asia. It was initiated, the gentrification of Williamsburg was initiated by the artists who were looking for the cheaper working and living space, and were in that sense displaced by high rents from East Village and moved across East River to Williamsburg in search of the cheap working and living space. So Greenpoint was affected by this early spontaneous, driven by the market forces, gentrification by the turn of the 20th and 21st century, but it was not gentrified to the degree that was characteristic for Williamsburg at the time. What was really crucial for the speed, acceleration of gentrification in both Williamsburg and Greenpoint was the city's, New York City's decision to rezone the waterfront area with this beautiful view on the skyline of Manhattan from industrial to residential area. Right? So this was the beginning of the process of gentrification that is classified by sociologists as city-sponsored, as navigated by the city. So it was an impulse for developers and not just artists, and people of alternative lifestyles, not even young hipsters, but regular upper middle class, yuppie style of consumers, customers to move into the neighborhood. So nowadays the gentrification, this is the plan, this is not a picture of the actual Greenpoint waterfront, this is the plan. Still the reality looks more like that, but after 2005 the New York City's government invested into the public infrastructure, into the bike lanes, recreational spaces, public parks, dog runs, and all the institutions that would fit the lifestyle and tastes of the new middle-class young American and hipster, meaning with intellectual and artistic aspiration people. In the meantime, Pod Wierchami was turned into the Amber Steakhouse. So this is the picture taken in 2010. Already in 2010, this farmer from Podlasie, at the time already in his mid-40s, was able to demolish profitable areas of investments, and it was obviously not industry anymore, but by the 1970s it was not anymore the residential areas in the suburbs or the edge cities located in the suburbs that combined the office parks and shopping malls. So in search of the profitable investment, they found out that real estate in cities was the one. And Saskia Sassen, who's an author of the term global city, discovered that by the 1980s, global business needed the places of concentration, such as London, New York City, or Tokyo, where business dealings could be done face to face. She was also able to explain why, at the same time, yuppies, middle class People were returning to cities, and New York City, with its rundown infrastructure and rundown industry and very high level of unemployment, was again attractive to immigrants. She argued that exactly immigrants, unlike domestic minorities, were able to serve as servants to this newly created global capitalist class. Janet Abulugot should be also mentioned here as an author of the study of the East Village gentrification, and also a researcher on the American global cities. What is important for my reasoning is that all those important theories of gentrification expected conflict, right? Because they saw gentrification as a clash of social classes, domination of upper classes over lower classes. They expected conflict and resistance. I expected it also because, as I demonstrated in some other article, Polish immigrants in New York City definitely play the role of, are a part of the working class. I argue that they play the role of the aristocracy of the working classes. Polishmen are overrepresented in the construction business that is very much appreciated by the male working class people, but nevertheless, definitely this is the working class. And yet, what I discovered was no organized opposition. Benevolent indifference, especially in 2006, during the first wave of my interviews with the community leaders, I found many of them not being quite aware of the gentrification was going on. They absolutely had no sense of agency. They treated gentrification as weather, right? A condition that was absolutely not connected with their will. It was not initiated by them, and they had no sense of influence on it, but like the weather, they felt they had to adapt. And finally, I found it was not the only, it was like that not all of 50 respondents expressed satisfaction because of gentrification, but it was not an attitude that didn't exist, and this was exactly extremely surprising. So what I'm going to speak about the dimensions of this satisfaction and upward mobility without moving. I just wanted to say that it's mostly based, what I'm going to say is mostly based on those 50 interviews with the immigrant community leaders whom I understood as people who knew community members more than average and were connected with Greenpoint in the way that they had businesses in Greenpoint, were employed, worked in some public institutions or ethnic organizations in Greenpoint, had property, many of them had property, had houses bought for $40,000 at the time, already worthy of $1 million. Property in the neighborhood. So people who knew community members better than average, plus those who had influence on the community. So these were biographical interviews with oral histories on their migration, working experience, memory of the neighborhood and New York City. And it was a part of the larger Project Polish Greenpoint in New York City, Gentrification, Ethnic Relations and Labor Market at the turn of the 20th and 21st century, that it was also based on the existing statistical data and local press analysis. So this is the term crucial for my interpretation, for my understanding of this benevolent attitude toward gentrification, as the community leaders experienced upward mobility, the value that is universally appreciated, not only in the American society, but in American society more than in other societies. without doing anything to cause it, to be responsible for it. It was not connected with the improvement of the education, occupational status. And probably this is clear and understandable and even obvious in the context of those community leaders who were property owners in the neighborhood, right? Because as I said, almost overnight they became millionaires. What I also discovered, and it's probably more thrilling and asking for interpretation, is the sense of that their prestige increased, although they were still in the same neighborhood, same buildings, same jobs, but their sense of being a Polish immigrant increased, because now they worked in a better neighborhood, more appreciated by the city elites, and this is the one that I call symbolic upward mobility without moving. So symbolic refers not that in Polish language, when you speak that you got a symbolic increase of a salary, it means that it's almost non-existing increase of a salary. So this is not what I mean. This is a term constructed by parallel with Pierre Bourdieu's French sociologist term symbolic violence, and this would be the upward mobility experienced in the sphere of culture, not necessarily connected with the material upward mobility. And I'm going to briefly discuss the 7 dimensions of the upward mobility, including symbolic upward mobility without moving, that I identified in the narratives of the 50 community leaders. So first of all, they were very much satisfied with that the gentrification of Greenpoint changed their position vis-à-vis Polish relatives and friends. Because nowadays, when they called or visited their relatives in Poland, they were not treated as business owners in a slum, in an immigrant ghetto, but as people coming from a poor neighborhood characterized as such by Gazeta Wyborcza or Super Express. So I can think especially of 2 owners of the travel agency located in Greenpoint that recall being very humiliated, where Gazeta Wyborcza published texts about the drunk working class, sex-hungry, violent and primitive men, and when Redliński's novels about exactly such Polish immigrants were published in Poland, because they were welcomed in Poland with irony and sense of that they were losers. Now, all of a sudden, they come to Poland as business owners, owning business in a cool neighborhood. The second dimension of this satisfaction was connected with the fact that that the leader's position within the New York City Polish immigrant community has improved. In the past, Greenpoint was at the bottom of the Polish ethnic immigrant neighborhoods in New York City, and it was an entrance neighborhood for the newcomers, for those most impoverished directly from the communist country, ready to work for lowest wages, living 8 men in one railroad apartment full of cockroaches. So all better established immigrants had ambition to move to some other place, especially in Queens, right? So I can think of another business owner, of beauty salon owner in her 60s, who came to the United States and to Greenpoint in the 1970s and has run her beauty salon for Polish immigrants and those American working class members since then. She spoke about those bitter conversations that she had with her friends that treated her in the past as a loser, exactly because she stayed in Greenpoint, because she decided to keep her business in Greenpoint. Although she regretted at the moment of interview in 2010 that she didn't buy more houses, more pieces of property in Greenpoint, and exactly at the time she already believed that this bad image of Greenpoint was responsible for this irrational move of not buying. Although she could afford, as she said, to buy half of Greenpoint, she didn't, because she couldn't liberate herself the sense of that this is Dziadowo, that this is at the bottom of the neighborhoods in New York City. The third, probably this dimension of the symbolic upward mobility without moving was among the intelligentsia members. There is people who work either in American public institutions such as schools or public libraries, or in Polish ethnic organizations located in Greenpoint, for example, journalists or political activists who felt flattered by the fact that they now lived in artistic and intellectual environment, that they were not surrounded only by working class people of their own ethnic origins, but by young American artistic types. This group also argued that the change in Greenpoint might have turned out to be good for the entire Polish-American community in New York City, that it might attract better educated and more business-oriented immigrants. Because of this black reputation of Greenpoint, New York City for 2 decades, in the 1980s and 1990s, attracted rather countryside and working class immigrants than well-educated people, right? So this was this idea that hipsters, Polish hipsters, might now be attracted to New York City rather than San Francisco. What I found also surprising was that community leaders were actually happy of losing Polish rank-and-file immigrants from the neighborhood, of that gentrification displaced what they called transit immigrants or tourists, those newcomers. And because the narratives that they developed were full of sense of that they were embarrassed and ashamed of Polishness that those transit immigrants represented vis-a-vis their own American-born children and the rest of the New York City's community. Hard-working construction workers, drunk on every Friday or urinating in the public park. So they believed that exclusion of the transit immigrants is actually better for their communication with their American-born children and for the entire ethnic community of Polish immigrants and Polish Americans in New York City. And the best symbol of that, this is the last thing I'm going to say, sorry, long. So the best symbol of this last approach to the gentrification that would not erase Polishness from Greenpoint, but rather commercialize it for the tastes of young Americans, would be the Warsaw Club, organized by the Polish National Home, with the slogan "Where pierogis meet punk," and I guess this is what Tomek ordered for lunch.
No, not exactly.
Not exactly. Right, and exactly commercialized elements of the Polish culture and presents it in the way that it's not perceived as in conflict with the American culture and hipster culture. Right? here in the slogan represented as punk. Okay, I'll be happy to answer all types of questions if we have time. I'm sorry for taking more long introduction.
Thank you very much. I've experienced in other parts of the city, and there are cities of the United States, and there's always one disadvantage. With the price of the home, taxes are going up on a massive scale. That happens, for example, in Washington, D.C. People have to leave their home because they cannot pay property taxes, because they have been going up tremendously. Is that the case here as well?
No, not really, because all those working class houses owned by Polish immigrants have spaces, have apartments, railroad apartments for rent.
Oh.
So the higher rent is able to compensate for the increase of taxes.
Okay.
But it's otherwise this would be exactly the case.
Okay.
Yes, I was wondering if you, in your studies, since it was from 2006 to 2010, accounted for the reverse migration back to Poland, which at that time was estimated in New York between 8 to 12%.
I mean, I know that these are the statistics and that the return migration and the, to Poland and the reorientation of Polish labor migrants from the United States to Great Britain, the Netherlands, Sweden, might be responsible for the gentrification of New York City. This was not the topic of my study. I focused on the existing community, but this was a general feeling. Everybody wanted to talk to me about that Greenpoint is dead and that it's gone and that it's finished, that there are no students coming to Greenpoint to work during vacation anymore. So there was a strong sense of that the old immigrant Greenpoint changed and ended.
No, that's very interesting. Also, you mentioned that Queens was always considered kind of a step up, and now this neighborhood, which Poles can afford, move from Greenpoint going north, is in Queens. Could you address what kind of neighborhood, what flavor does that neighborhood have? Because they can afford it still, right?
But is your question about Greenpoint or a new Polish neighborhood?
The new Polish neighborhood where those who can't afford to stay in Greenpoint move to.
Yeah, so this
and
is
it's in Queens, which always was considered in New York a step up.
Yeah, but it changed, right?
Exactly, that's why I would like to
of Brooklyn
find out.
Definitely changed the geography of prestige in New York City. So these are the three neighborhoods. These are the three neighborhoods here: Ridgewood, Glendale, and Maspeth. Ridgewood is most similar to Greenpoint in the sense of having houses with the apartments for rent. So this is good for new immigrants who are predominantly renters. Maspeth and Glendale are the two neighborhoods more for better established long-term Polish immigrants without good public transportation connections with individual houses for those who are car owners and so on and so forth. So Ridgewood is discursively also by Nowy Dziennik, the largest Polish language newspaper in New York City, created for a new little Poland in New York City. The neighborhood is mixed like Greenpoint was. I like to call it Little Eastern Europe because it has an important share of immigrants from former Yugoslavia, including the Bosnian refugees from Albania. It has a like Greenpoint. It has a important share of the Puerto Rican, people of Puerto Rican Hispanic origins. What's appreciated by Polish immigrants in Ridgewood is that it's architecture. The neighborhood, formerly German neighborhood, organized also at the end of the 19th and 20th century, is dominated by the brick houses. Also rather modest and built for the working class people, but not wooden frame houses, but brick houses. This is all something that immigrants really wanted to tell me, that Ridgewood is actually better. We don't feel displaced from Greenpoint because the living conditions in Ridgewood are better. It's more greenery in Ridgewood. The fact is that Ridgewood is not so well connected with Manhattan as Greenpoint is in terms of public transportation. But it was not considered to be huge disadvantage by Polish immigrants. They would always tell me that the subway running through Greenpoint, the J train, was terrible. That this was the worst train in the city, so Ridgewood is even better in that sense, although it takes 15 more minutes to get to Manhattan.
That answers my question. And I'm glad you also addressed the communication issue, because my suspicion would be that Greenpoint has survived the white flight to the suburbs or somewhere else, partly because of the transportation system, because it's kind of a special leg of the subway you have to transfer to go to Greenpoint. It's not the most convenient way to connect with other lines. But also you pointed out that there was a grassroots movement in the community to only rent by word of mouth.
Yeah, sociologists usually argue that this was really
the main reason.
Right, and in that sense Greenpoint would be similar to Italian neighborhoods in New York City, such as Bensonhurst, in Brooklyn on Howard Beach, in Queens, also famous or even more famous for their racist attacks. So Greenpoint never had any black men killed over crossing the border of the neighborhood in search of a white girlfriend, right, as Howard Beach or Bensonhurst had. But the fact is that the community organized this anti-black, anti-Latino policies. And they had also the sense of that these policies, grassroots policies, were against the city's policies, and that they had fight for themselves against all laws.
There's a pressing question. I think we interrupt you, and thank you very much. We do need to move on. I think, of the schedule today, but this was very interesting and